Hi there, my name is Jim Amers. I wrote this paper with Elizabeth Graham, and I'll be delivering it today. I apologize for my scratchy voice. I'm just getting over a cold, but it is a cold. It's not COVID. So we're going to talk about Lamanai today, but the image on the lower section of the screen of an overgrown Tikal in Guatemala really represents, I think, how archaeologists and many people think of the terminal classic Maya world from about 800 AD to AD 1050. Sites like Tikal and many others were abandoned, leading archaeologists to call the terminal classic typically a time of collapse. Although we see great variation in the timing and nature of the changes, and many archaeologists actually now reject the term collapse for the terminal classic because of that variation, there is no doubt that Maya civilization was transformed, and changes are particularly clear among artifacts associated with elite people in site cores. Lamanai also changed, but the site is unusual because it was continually occupied right into the historic period. And in this presentation, we discuss some of the factors that might have led to this community's relative stability through a period of radical change in the Maya world. We're going to highlight Lamanai's strategic location on the New River and other factors that are a little bit more difficult to identify in archaeology. So the earliest evidence of occupation at Lamanai is maize pollen from the lagoon that dates to about 1600 BC. As you can see on this list of time periods, the pre-classic period at Lamanai is dated 1500 BC to 8250. And in that early era, Lamanai is really very similar to other sites in the Maya lowlands. Pre-classic architecture at Lamanai follows the general conventions found at other sites, for example, sort of masks on stair-side outsets of temple platforms. And the pottery of the pre-classic period at Lamanai is also stylistically and technologically very similar to pottery from sites really right across the Maya lowlands. This is some Sierra group ceramics from the pre-classic period looked very similar anywhere in the Maya lowlands, suggesting that even by the pre-classic there was really intense interaction across the Maya lowlands. In the classic period, which is dated 250 to 750 AD, Lamanai remains keyed into the rest of the region, and it's in the early part of the early classic that we see pottery styles that are very similar to pottery styles in the sort of heartland of the Petén of Guatemala or the Belize Valley. Around 450 or 500, however, Lamanai pottery styles seem to diverge a little bit from styles to the south and west. A good example of this is this little polychrome dish with a cute little hummingbird in the center that was found in one of the two tombs in structure N956, which you may know as the Mask Temple at Lamanai. This actually predates the masks on the temple and probably dates to about 500 AD. The terminal classic at Lamanai is dated from 750 AD to about 900 or 960. And this was a time of great change. And as I said, at many sites, this period represents, as the name terminal classic implies, the end of the classic period and the end of occupation. But it's really important to emphasize that not every site was abandoned in the terminal classic. And at sites at Lamanai and sites that were not abandoned, the terminal classic really just marks the end of the classic period culture. For example, at sites like Tipu in the Belize Valley or sites in the Petén Lakes region of Guatemala, and some sites on the Belizean Cayes were occupied right into the colonial era. And another important point is the decline and abandonment of sites across the Maya lowlands varied in time from as early as about AD 750 in the Petén Petun region of Guatemala to as late as 1050 or later at Chichen Itza and in Mexico. The term abandonment, like the term collapse, is used somewhat variably and maybe too loosely in archaeology. The abandonment, for example, of Chichen Itza is typically placed at about 1050 AD, but the site was never lost, and it remained an important pilgrimage site into the post-classic and historic periods. And similarly, the fertile lands around deteriorating or even abandoned classic period site cores across the Maya lowlands almost certainly continued to be used by local farmers after the classic. Recently, some scholars have asserted that the terminal classic changes at Lamanai were so dramatic that the site was really not all that different from sites like Tikal or Karakol that experienced dramatic decline. And we agree that there were major changes at Lamanai, but our evidence shows that these changes impacted the elites much more strongly than the general population outside the site core. Evidence for what David Pendergast called stability through change at Lamanai includes Linda Howey's research on the ways in which pots were made in the Terminal Classic and early Post-Classic. Howey found a lot of continuity in ceramic technology, although the surface treatments were responding to new elite tastes. We believe that by the end of the early Classic, Lamanai was already allying itself with commercial interests that extended around the Yucatan Peninsula, indicated by those arrows. Lamanai traders and merchants may have distributed salt from the Belizean Keys during the late Classic, and if you want more on salt, you can read, for example, Joe Ball's 1977 article. But by the Terminal Classic, the salt trade declined and gave way to trade in a variety of goods. Both Lamanai and the Keys reflect movements of people from the coast inland. For example, Linda Howey was able to show that one of the pottery technology groups at Lamanai in the Terminal Classic was from Altun Ha. There seems to be a great deal of movement of people around the peninsula in general in the Terminal Classic. One indication of population movement is changes in burial practices at Lamanai. Distinctive face-down burials appear at Marco Gonzalez on Ambergris Key in the Terminal Classic around the 800s, and then into Lamanai in the early Post-Classic around 80, 1000, suggesting this kind of movement inland. So there's plenty of change in the Terminal Classic at Lamanai, but these changes seem to represent new people at the top with new ideas and new practices, rather than the sort of disintegration that we see so often at other sites. The post-classic period at Lamanai begins around 900 or 960 and ends with the arrival of the Spanish in the region in 1544. The early post-classic pottery of Lamanai shows the clearest break from the stylistic canons of the southern lowlands of Belize and Guatemala. Of particular interest are the Zacpa group ceramics, some of which are shown here. A type in this ceramic group called Zalao gouged and sized. The vessel here, if you can see my cursor, this type shows both the new popularity of incised decoration over painted polychrome decoration that was popular in the classic periods, and the design themselves are related to the various types of fine orange ware pottery that are found first way over on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. For example, flowers and reptilian motifs, and an absence of jaguar imagery. These shared designs suggest some sort of long-distance interaction in the early post-classic period, made possible, we think, by intensive coastal traffic and trade, but that was still a continuation of earlier trends. So, similarly, a late post-classic type found at Lamanai, palmule incised, is very common along the coasts of Quintana Roo and Yucatan. So how do we explain the success of Lamanai for so many centuries? The site's strategic location on the New River, which connects the central Maya lowlands to the Caribbean coast, is surely relevant here. The diversity of ceramics and other forms of material culture at Lamanai suggests that the site was a center of commerce and trade, with a resilient commercial class that, if not exactly in control, was highly influential. Lamanai's importance as a port made it desirable to groups moving around the peninsula as the collapse of dynasties across the Maya lowlands in the Terminal Classic left a vacuum in trade opportunities. Dr. Graham believes that merchants of the era were not bystanders, but were responsible for conflicts against long-standing royal dynasties. For their part, some royals probably allied themselves with these new mercantile powers. Pendergast has attributed Lamanai's perseverance in part to its location along the New River Lagoon, which was a rich freshwater resource that provided a means of subsistence, transportation, communication, and trade with other regions of Mesoamerica. And another obvious benefit of the site's location is the availability of fresh water, which would have been especially important in periods of drought. By drought, in this case, we mean lower annual rainfall that was significant enough to affect agricultural production. In the last 20 years or so, evidence for drought in the Terminal Classic has been accumulating, and drought has become a favorite explanation for the decline and abandonment of sites across the Maya world. Most archaeologists acknowledge, however, that lower annual rainfall was probably just one of a variety of challenges faced by the Maya in the Terminal Classic. Importantly, evidence of lower rainfall has not been found everywhere where sites were abandoned dramatically, and the Petech-Petun region of Guatemala is a great example of that. And so this suggests that lower rainfall or drought was just one of a number of factors that led to change. It's also worth noting that, as we know, humans can change the climate. Deforestation in some areas of the lowlands may have created or exacerbated drought-like conditions. It is possible that the Maya around Lamanai were able to manage their natural resources and environment more effectively than people at other sites, but that's really very hard to demonstrate archaeologically. The new river provided access to both the coast and the interior, and the stylistic diversity of ceramics at Lamanai, especially those found near the lagoon during the excavations for the tourist center and museum there, suggests that trade was important at the site. The architecture of the central Ottawa Group Royal or Regal residential complex shows connections to the Gulf Coast in its architectural styles as early as the 700s, and the post-classic pottery also shows stylistic connections to the Gulf Coast that I've written about. The male of the late post-classic so-called loving couple burial at Lamanai was buried with a pair of copper tweezers in West Mexican style. I've tried to highlight them there on the slide. These had circular blades that probably served as a badge of rank or status, and they were still, as Christine White has noted, they're still displayed this way in Western Mexico at the time of Spanish contact. Similarly, the women in the burial, the woman in that burial wore a hairstyle that was common in ancient Western Mexico and is still seen there today. Turning to politics, we know that Lamanai was a large site with at least regional importance, and some form of political leadership had to exist there. However, there are indications that control of the site by a royal dynasty or dynasties may not have been as strong or as central at Lamanai as at other sites, which may have saved it. In the 7th century, dynasts seem to have attempted to gain control, but it didn't last, as shown by the toppling of Stela 9 and the deliberate buildup of midden material around the Stela temple. Religion and religious ritual, of course, explain why Maya site cores are dominated by temple pyramids, and deep middens at Lamanai in the site core indicate that ritual activity was important at the site throughout its occupation. Broken late post-classic Chenmul modeled incense burners at structure N956 called the Mass Temple suggest pilgrimage to the site that likely continued into the historic period, even as occupation continued. Religious movements, which also stimulate cultural, economic, and political change, have been major factors in world history forever. So think of the widespread influence of Christianity or Islam. And there's really no reason that Mesoamerica couldn't have experienced similar movements. In 1998, Bill Ringel and others proposed what they called a Cult of Quetzalcoatl, a network of shrine centers dedicated primarily to Quetzalcoatl or Maya Kukulkan. That may have emerged as early as the late Classic, but are most evident in the Terminal Classic. In a 2004 article, Ringel clarified this, quote, cult, quote, as a set of imagery, beliefs, and practices associated with an ideology of leadership, which seems to have expanded militarily with messianic vigor. So combination there of military, political, and religious significance. Chichen Itza is the proposed easternmost node of that network, but there are hints that I've discussed in a 2014 publication that Lamanai could have been involved. Although Chichen Itza may have been extremely influential because of its status as a major center for honoring Quetzalcoatl, Ringel and his colleagues don't suggest that it directly controlled other sites, or certainly not any as far away as Lamanai. Lamanai may have been one of the more distant sites that drew on the status and prestige of the cult. And as Ringel says, a model holding that certain major sites acted as centers of legitimation for larger hinterlands through much of Mesoamerican prehistory may be an attractive alternative to explanations based on trade, military conquest, or site emulation for sort of the influence of Chichen Itza. So the Spanish colonial period at Lamanai is dated from about AD 1544 to about about AD 1700. British settlement in the area overlaps with Spanish occupation from the 1660s to 1862. And from 1862 to 1964, Belize was a British crown colony, then a self-governing crown colony from 1964 to independence in 1981. So Lamanai is an example of a community whose prosperity derived from commerce. Commerce exploded in the pre-classic and early classic, but the fall of Teotihuacan in central Mexico around AD 550 had reverberations everywhere. Trade relationships around central Mexico, and importantly, at least as far as the Gulf Coast, would have been renegotiated. So, traditions that originated outside of the Maya lowlands seem to have been percolating into Lamanai since the end of the early Classic. The turbulence of the terminal Classic in the Maya lowlands seems to have intensified the changes that occurred at Lamanai, but the changes we see are really mostly in elite-related artifacts and architecture. The resilience of Lamanai likely has something to do with its strategic location, those cosmopolitan connections, and perhaps, although this is harder to see archaeologically, a different constellation of ideas and practices related to leadership at the site. So that's what we have to say today. We welcome correspondence or comments from you, and thanks for listening.